It's 1200 BC, somewhere along the Nile, and you've just woken up with cramping pain low in your stomach. You already know what's coming. In a civilization built entirely around a single river, this is one of the most common ways to start a morning because that same river is your water source, your food source, your sewage system, and your bathroom, all layered on top of each other in the same few hundred meters of muddy bank. Here's the assumption you probably walked in with. Ancient Egyptians just squatted somewhere and suffered through it. No real medicine, no real understanding of what was happening inside them. That assumption is wrong, and it's wrong in a specific way. Egyptian physicians didn't just treat stomach illness, they wrote it down, categorized it, and prescribed specific remedies for specific symptoms, in documents that are still readable today, more than 3,000 years later. And here's the loop I want you to sit with. Some of what they figured out about gut health, purging, and internal blockages wasn't replaced by better medical thinking until shockingly recently in some cases, not until the last couple hundred years. Today we're going through why Egyptians got sick this way constantly, what their doctors actually believed was happening inside the body, the specific remedies written into their medical papyri, the surprisingly modern logic behind some of those remedies, and the strange, semi-mystical theory of internal plumbing that tied the whole system together. By the end, you'll understand why a civilization we associate with pyramids and gold was, on a totally different level, one of history's first documented gastroenterology programs. The core idea is this: Egyptian medicine didn't ignore diarrhea. It built an entire theory of the human body around explaining it. Start with why this happened constantly in the first place. The Nile flooded every year, depositing rich black silt that made Egyptian farming possible. This is literally why the civilization exists where it does. But that same river carried human waste, animal waste, and agricultural runoff downstream to the exact communities drinking from it. There was no separation between drinking water and wastewater the way modern infrastructure enforces one. It was one river doing every job at once. Add in the heat, which accelerates bacterial growth in food and standing water. Plus, a diet heavy in bread and beer being a dietary staple, not a luxury brewed in conditions that weren't always sanitary, and you get a population that dealt with gastrointestinal illness constantly. It isn't an occasional inconvenience in this setting. It's closer to a background condition of daily life. This is why Egyptian medical texts don't treat stomach illness as some rare, mysterious ailment. It shows up constantly, described in careful, repeated detail because doctors were seeing it constantly. Think about the actual daily mechanics of this. Drinking water was drawn from the same river that fields were irrigated from, that animals waded through, that boats and barges moved along, and that towns along its banks used for washing and waste disposal. There wasn't a separate clean branch of the Nile reserved for consumption. Filtration existed in only the crudest sense, letting sediment settle, sometimes straining through cloth, nothing that would remove the microorganisms actually responsible for most of this illness. Bread, another dietary staple, was baked from grain that could carry contamination from storage or handling. And Egyptian bread baking methods, while effective at producing calories, weren't designed with modern food safety in mind because that concept didn't exist yet. None of this was unique negligence. It was simply what living beside a single, multi-purpose river looked like. For everyone, all the time. Move 2. The evidence. Several Egyptian medical papyri survive today, and multiple of them deal directly with digestive illness. The Ebers Papyrus, dated to around 1550 BC and roughly 20 meters long when unrolled, contains hundreds of remedies, a large number of which target the stomach and bowels specifically. The Chester Beatty Medical Papyrus, dated to roughly 1200 BC, focuses specifically on anorectal disease, making it the earliest known text devoted entirely to that part of the body, alongside a section on headache remedies. It isn't vague folk advice scattered randomly through the text. Symptoms are described, remedies are listed with actual measured ingredients, and, in some cases, instructions specify exactly how the remedy should be prepared and administered. This is a structured medical tradition, being passed from physician to physician, refined and rewritten across generations closer to a textbook than a superstition. The Ebers Papyrus alone contains somewhere around 700 to 800 individual remedies and formulas, organized loosely by ailment, covering everything from wound care to eye disease to, repeatedly, digestive complaints. Ingredients weren't grabbed at random, measurements are given in specific units, and certain remedies note how many days a treatment should be continued or what time of day it should be taken. It reads less like folklore and more like an early pharmacological reference guide. Assembled by people who were paying close, repeated attention to what actually helped and writing that knowledge down so the next physician wouldn't have to relearn it from nothing. Here's where it gets genuinely strange and genuinely fascinating. Egyptian physicians believed the body contained a system of channels called metu, connecting the heart to every other organ, carrying blood, air, water, and waste alike, not unlike how they imagined the Nile's canal system distributing water across farmland. When those channels became blocked or corrupted, illness followed. At the center of this was a concept called wud, often translated roughly as putrefaction or decaying matter. The theory held that undigested or rotting material inside the body could generate a kind of internal poison, which then spread through the metu and caused disease, including the gut pain and irregular bowel movements we'd now call diarrhea or dysentery. It isn't germ theory. Egyptians had no concept of bacteria. But it's a remarkably close conceptual cousin, a belief that something toxic building up inside the body from spoiled or improperly processed material was making people sick, and that clearing it out was the path to recovery. The mechanism was wrong. The instinct that decay equals danger was accurate. It's worth sitting with how coherent this framework actually was, even without modern science behind it. If your body is a network of channels like irrigation canals, and canals get blocked by silt and debris, then a body gets blocked by decaying matter the same way. Health means channels flowing freely. Illness means something has clogged the system. It's an explanation built directly out of the same engineering logic Egyptians used to manage their actual river applied inward, onto the body, because that was the most sophisticated systems thinking they had available to reach for. If decay inside the body was the disease, the treatment followed logically: get it out. Egyptian physicians relied heavily on purgatives and laxatives, prescribed specifically to clear out whatever UEDW was believed to be causing the problem. Castor oil shows up repeatedly in the medical papyri as a laxative, and this is one of those small details that lands harder than it should. Because castor oil is still recognized today as an effective natural laxative, still referenced in modern herbal and pharmaceutical contexts thousands of years later. Other remedies combined ingredients like dates, figs, and various plant extracts mixed into pastes or liquids and taken orally, with dosing and preparation instructions specific enough that modern researchers have been able to reconstruct several of them fairly precisely. It's the reverse problem of what you'd expect walking in. You'd assume the challenge was treating diarrhea itself. Often, it was closer to the opposite. Physicians were deliberately inducing bowel movements as a form of treatment for other ailments entirely, believing that clearing the gut would clear the underlying corruption driving a whole range of illnesses, not just stomach pain specifically. Beer even shows up as a delivery method for some of these remedies, herbs and other active ingredients mixed into beer, which was already a dietary staple and easy to consume in measured amounts. Honey appears frequently too, both for its own properties and as a way to make less pleasant ingredients tolerable to actually swallow. None of this reads as guesswork. It reads as physicians working with a fixed set of known effective materials, adjusting the combination and delivery method to the specific complaint in front of them. Move 5, and this one tends to surprise people the most. Egyptians didn't just treat digestive illness through the mouth. They developed and used enemas extensively administered rectally, using specially designed tools. Sometimes described as reed or horn-based devices connected to a bladder or container of liquid. This wasn't a vague or unofficial role. Either, court physicians could hold the actual title guardian of the anus or guardian of the royal rectum for those serving the pharaoh directly, a specialization documented on tomb inscriptions dating as far back as roughly 2200 BC, including physicians who held that title alongside titles like physician of the belly and physician of the eyes on the same monument. This was a recognized, named medical specialty, not folklore. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing centuries later around 440 BC, noted that Egyptians purged themselves regularly by his account, roughly 3 days out of every month as a preventive health measure, not just as treatment after getting sick. That framing matters. This wasn't an emergency intervention reserved for the severely ill. It was treated closer to routine self-care, something a healthy person might do periodically as prevention, the same general instinct behind modern ideas about digestive health and gut maintenance minus, obviously. The actual science explaining why it does or doesn't help. The tools themselves, reconstructed from archaeological and textual evidence, suggest a fairly standardized design. A reservoir for liquid connected to a narrow applicator, simple in construction but clearly built specifically for this one repeated purpose, not improvised from random household objects. It isn't purely clinical, though, and that's worth being honest about. Alongside measured doses and physical remedies, many treatments in the medical papyri are paired with spoken spells or invocations to specific gods meant to be recited while administering the remedy. Medicine and religion weren't separate categories to Egyptian physicians the way they are for most people now. A remedy could be simultaneously a physical treatment and a spiritual one, addressed to deities associated with healing, like Isis or Thoth, without any sense of contradiction. This is the part that gets me a little. It's not that the magic replaced the medicine, or that the medicine was secretly hiding behind magic as an excuse. Both operated at the same time, treated as equally real components of why a remedy worked or didn't. A modern doctor separates the physical treatment from any belief system around it. An Egyptian physician didn't need to, and didn't see why they should. There's a dry, almost funny detail buried in some of these dual-purpose remedies. 2 certain spells specifically instruct the patient or physician to recite the words a set number of times, as if dosage applied to the incantation just as much as it applied to the castor oil. 4 times, or 7 times, repeated with the same precision as a measured spoonful. Whatever you think about whether the words did anything, the seriousness with which they were administered was completely genuine. One last piece before the turn. Egyptian physicians were often specialized. Some medical texts reference doctors focused specifically on the eyes, others on the teeth, others explicitly on the belly, treating internal complaints as their own specialty area rather than something any general healer handled. This level of specialization, this early, isn't something every ancient civilization had. Physicians trained formally, often connected to temple institutions, learning from written texts that had already been copied, corrected, and passed down for generations by the time any individual doctor got access to them. A physician treating your stomach pain in 1200 BC wasn't improvising. They were working from a written tradition already centuries old. Some of these physicians achieved real status figures like Imhotep, who lived close to 1500 years before the period in this story, roughly 2650 BC, was already remembered as the legendary founder of Egyptian medicine by this point, and would eventually be elevated to full divine status as a god of medicine and healing centuries after that. That's not a culture treating doctors as hired hands. That's a culture capable of eventually elevating its most legendary physician into a figure worshipped for centuries after his death. Here's where this story turns over. For most of this video, ancient Egyptian gut illness has been framed as a hardship, a constant, exhausting side effect of living beside a river that gave and took in equal measure. But look at what that constant hardship actually produced. Some of the earliest recorded medical specialization in human history. One of the earliest recorded uses of a still effective natural laxative, a documented rectal treatment tradition thousands of years ahead of its supposed reinvention in later medical history, and an entire theoretical framework flawed in its mechanism, but structurally similar in its logic for how internal toxins cause disease. The thing that looks, on the surface, like Egypt's grossest daily inconvenience is also one of the clearest windows into how sophisticated their medical thinking actually was. It isn't a footnote to their civilization, it's one of the more advanced parts of it. Think about what it actually takes for a society to reach this point. You need enough written language infrastructure that medical knowledge can survive past a single physician's lifetime. You need enough institutional continuity through temples, through training systems, that texts get copied accurately across generations instead of degrading into rumor. And you need physicians willing to write down what actually worked, repeatedly, rather than treating medical knowledge as secret or personal. Egypt had all three, applied specifically to a problem most people today would consider too undignified to take seriously as a marker of civilizational sophistication. Compare that to how long it took Western medicine to catch back up. For much of European medical history, well into relatively recent centuries, purging and bloodletting were used indiscriminately, often without the careful symptom-specific reasoning Egyptian physicians had already applied thousands of years earlier. Germ theory, the actual correct explanation for why contaminated water and food make people sick, wasn't established until the 1800s. It's a strange kind of irony. A civilization we picture in the popular imagination as ancient and mystical had, in this one narrow area, a more organized and specialized medical response to gut illness than societies that came thousands of years after them. Rectal treatment methods similar in basic concept to Egyptian practice weren't formally reintroduced into mainstream Western medicine until many centuries later. Often credited to physicians who had no idea a version of the same idea had already been written down, tested, and refined on the banks of the Nile. Go back to that morning along the Nile, 1200 BC. The pain is still there, low in your stomach, same as it was at the start of this video. But now you know something the person waking up sick doesn't have to know for it to already be working in their favor. Somewhere nearby, a physician trained in a tradition already centuries old has a written remedy for exactly this, measured out from ingredients like castor oil and figs, possibly paired with a few spoken words to a god of healing, built on a theory about internal decay that got the mechanism wrong, but the instinct right. They didn't understand bacteria. They understood enough. So here's the question I'll leave you with. How much of what we assume separates primitive medicine from modern medicine is really about knowledge? And how much of it is really about how carefully people bothered to write things down? Let me know in the comments. See you soon.